This move initiates the English opening, a flexible system that immediately contests the center by controlling the d5 square and prepares to develop pieces on the queenside. This move initiates a Queen's Indian defense setup, aiming to fianchetto the Queen's bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal, while delaying central pawn commitment. This move establishes central pawn control and aims to develop quickly, challenging Black's flank opening intentions. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to b7, establishing control over the long diagonal and supporting the central pawn. This pawn push immediately challenges Black's central pawn and aims to gain space on the queenside, a common strategy in asymmetrical openings like the English or Queen's Indian defenses. This move prematurely develops the queen, exposing it to attack and hindering the development of other pieces, which is generally considered an unsound strategy in this early stage of the Queen's Indian defense setup. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares to castle kingside, while also indirectly challenging the Black Queen's active but potentially vulnerable position. This move, 4b4, develops a piece aggressively, challenging White's nc3 and preparing to potentially disrupt White's central pawn control and kingside development. This move develops the bishop to a supportive square, preparing to castle and potentially challenge Black's advanced queen on h4. Developing the knight to f6 now aims to challenge White's central pawn push and prepare for kingside castling, while also unpinning the bishop on b4. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop, solidifies the center, and potentially challenges Black's exposed queen. Black removes the defender of the d-pawn, aiming to exploit White's slightly weakened pawn structure and open the bishop's diagonal towards the queenside. This recapture on c3 develops the bishop and clarifies the pawn structure, allowing White to focus on further development and control of the center after Black's somewhat unusual queen sortie. This move brings the knight to a strong central outpost, attacking White's d5 pawn and potentially disrupting White's pawn structure while creating tactical opportunities. This move uncovers the queen, connects the rooks, and prepares to contest the central d-file while simultaneously discouraging Black's knight from further advanced central activity. This move exchanges a knight for a bishop, simplifying the position and potentially aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns White will now possess. White recaptures the bishop, solidifying the central pawn majority and preparing to castle kingside after further development. Developing the king to safety and bringing the rook into play is a crucial step in this early positional battle, consolidating the queenside development and preparing for central action. This move initiates a pawn structure that aims to support the d5 pawn and potentially launch a kingside attack. This move redirects the queen, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats against the White king or gain an outpost for the queen. This move creates a pawn shield for the king, preparing for kingside castling and to contest the central d-file. This move repositions the queen to a safer square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a queenside expansion with c5. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, preparing to support the pawn chain and potentially join in an attack on Black's queenside pawn majority. Developing the bishop to b7 activates this piece on a long diagonal, putting pressure on White's central pawn structure and preparing to support the knight's eventual advance or control key squares. Castling queenside initiates an attacking game by bringing the king to safety and activating the rooks for potential pawn pushes and central control. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to contest the d-file, potentially opening lines for the rooks and creating counterplay in the center. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's central control and aims to open the g-file for attacking possibilities, though it does weaken white's kingside pawn structure. The knight repositions to d7, supporting the advance of the e-pawn and preparing to contest the open d-file, creating a more solid pawn structure. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to gain queenside space and potentially restrict black's kingside activity, while also preparing for a potential g5 advance to challenge the knight. The queen retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's kingside pawns and potentially participate in the central fight. This move initiates a queen trade, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward pawn structure in the open g-file later in the middle game. The knight's recapture on f6 activates this piece, clears the g-file for potential pawn advances, and aims to contest the central squares in this strategically complex middle game. This move boldly advances the e-pawn, challenging black's central pawn and aiming to create a passed pawn on the d-file while opening lines for white's pieces. This knight repositions to a more central square, aiming to challenge white's advanced g4 pawn and potentially support a future advance of the d-pawn. This move initiates a knight repositioning, aiming to bring the piece to a more active central square and potentially support a kingside advance or control key central squares. This move repositions the knight to the central e5 square, potentially targeting the weak d3 square and preparing to challenge white's central pawn control. Developing the bishop to e2 allows it to defend the kingside pawn structure and prepares to connect the rooks, aiming for central control and potential kingside action. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the d5 pawn and potentially create attacking opportunities. On the kingside, the king's cautious trek towards the queenside, facilitated by Kade2, aims to centralize and improve king safety while potentially supporting future pawn advances or maneuvering pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the potential weakness on f3 and preparing to challenge white's kingside control. bd3 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weak pawns on black's kingside and preparing to support an advance of the g-pawn. This move activates the bishop to a strong diagonal, potentially pressuring white's queenside and preparing to challenge the nc3 knight. King's centralization with k3 is a bold but potentially risky maneuver, aiming to activate the king in a complex middle game while neglecting the development of other pieces and the control of the queenside. This knight sacrifice on g2 exploits the exposed black king and the misplaced white pieces, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create attacking chances. The king retreats to safety after the check, avoiding further immediate complications and preparing to reorganize its defenses. The knight returns to f4, a strategic repositioning to control key central squares like e6 and d5, while also preparing to support a potential pawn advance on the kingside or to retreat to g6 if threatened. This move prepares to activate the rook along the second rank, aiming to challenge black's active knight and potentially pressure the queenside pawns. Black repositions the rook to the semi-open e-file, aiming to increase pressure on white's central pawn structure and prepare potential advances of the f-pawn or g-pawn. The move b3 aims to provide a haven for the king and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn push with b4, while also supporting the knight on c3. The rook's repositioning to e7 aims to bolster the e-file defense and potentially prepare for an e5 pawn push, while also creating a retreat square on e8 if necessary. The white king repositions back to e3, seeking a more active central post from which it can support the kingside pawn advances and potentially join the endgame fight, while also avoiding further checks on the d-file. This move fights for central space and prepares to develop the bishop on c8. But it also weakens the d6 pawn and might allow white to gain a strong outpost on e4. This knight move aims to reposition the piece for better central control and potential attacking opportunities on the kingside, while also defending the pawn structure. The exchange of knights on d3 opens the e-file for black's rook and potentially creates an outpost on e5 for white's knight if it can be supported. This exchange simplifies the position by removing black's active knight, creating a more open board where white's rook can become more influential on the d-file. This move prepares to activate the rook on the queenside and challenge white's control of the a-file, aiming for a more active rook position. This knight move develops a piece to a more active square, aiming to support potential pawn advances on the kingside or to reposition towards the center. This move prepares to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, likely c6 or b7, to support the e5 pawn and potentially challenge white's control of the queenside. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to create space and potential weaknesses on the opponent's kingside while solidifying white's positional advantage. This move initiates queenside counterplay by challenging white's pawn structure and creating potential attacking opportunities on the a-file. This move aims to solidify white's queenside pawn structure and prevent black's a-pawn from advancing further, potentially preparing for a future b4-b5 pawn push to gain space. This pawn capture opens the a-file, creating immediate pressure and a potential pathway for white's rook to penetrate black's position. This pawn capture on the a-file opens up a clear path for the rook to become active, immediately challenging black's control of the central files and potentially creating threats on the queenside. This move challenges white's queen and bishop on the queenside, aiming to create an active outpost for the rook and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. The move rb2 prepares to reinforce the b-pawn and potentially create a passed pawn on the b-file after further pawn advances, while also keeping an eye on the center. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support the pawn advance on the queenside and potentially challenge white's control of the open b-file. This move seeks to activate the rook on the c-file, aiming to contest the open file and potentially create pressure against black's queenside pawns if the a-pawn is advanced further. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the long diagonal and potentially supporting future pawn breaks or exchanges. This pawn push advances the queenside majority, aiming to open lines and create dynamic play against black's compact but somewhat passive position. Black's move 35, Re8 activates the rook to its last open file, creating immediate pressure on white's queenside pawns and preparing for potential infiltration. This move breaks open the c-file, creating immediate tactical possibilities and challenging black's central pawn majority. This move opens the c-file for black's rook, enabling it to become active on an open line and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or challenge white's central control. This knight move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing to contest the central squares. This move offers a simplification that addresses white's initiative on the kingside and potentially opens up the bishop's diagonal for black's rook. This pawn capture opens the g-file for potential kingside attacking chances and eliminates a key defender of black's kingside, but it also weakens white's pawn structure around their king. This move aims to activate the rook on the third rank, potentially pressuring white's central pawns or preparing a maneuver to the kingside. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's advanced passed pawn on a4 and potentially create counterplay on the c-file. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to contest the open files and potentially support pawn breaks or defend vulnerable kingside positions. The exchange of rooks on a3 simplifies the position, allowing white to consolidate their pawn structure and prepare for endgame play. This move forces a recapture, simplifying the position and aiming to eliminate white's active rook before its support arrives. The king, having previously been on a dangerous square, now retreats to a safer central position, preparing to support the rook's advance on the kingside. The move is a positional attempt to activate the rook on the third rank, aiming to pressure white's pawn structure and potentially create infiltration opportunities on the queenside, though it leaves the kingside less defended. The rook advances to c6, aiming to activate on the open c-file and potentially attack the weak pawn on b6 if black's king moves to a safer square. This move aims to activate the rook on the queenside and challenge white's control of the open b-file, though it allows white to consolidate their pawn majority on the kingside. This move captures the pawn, activating the rook and creating threats along the now open d-file. The rook on a3 now has a clear path to the kingside, aiming to support the king's safety and potentially generate counterplay by targeting white's weakened pawn structure. The rook swings to the 6th rank, attacking the isolated b4 pawn and preparing to infiltrate black's position on the queenside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. The king is centralized and actively participates in the endgame by seeking out the weakened kingside pawns. This pawn push aims to create space on the kingside, potentially supporting further attacking ideas or restricting black's pieces from accessing this area. This move creates a crucial mating threat along the back rank, forcing white to defend immediately. This move activates the king, bringing it into the center to support the potential promotion of the passed pawn and to defend against any lingering threats from black's rook. The rook on b1, now supported by the king and aiming towards the queenside, prepares to participate in potential pawn races or support advances on that flank. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file by forcing black to capture, which also opens the h-file for white's rook to potentially infiltrate black's position. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the g-file, which is a common strategic goal in such endgame positions where pawn structure is crucial for winning chances. The move fxg6 creates a passed pawn on the g-file and opens the g-file for the rook, aiming to create mating threats or disrupt black's king safety. The pawn on g6 now controls important squares and creates a protected passed pawn potential, while the king finds safety behind this new structure. This rook move aims to support the advance of the h-pawn, potentially creating a passed pawn or opening lines for kingside activity. This move forces white's king to an awkward square, disrupting white's plan to consolidate and creating further tactical possibilities for black. This king's maneuver aims to escape the discovered check and reposition to defend the g2 pawn. The rook repositions to the first rank to challenge the open a-file and prepare for potential endgame advantages or counterplay. This move repositions the rook to the h-file, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially create mating threats on the kingside. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's vulnerable king and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. On the kingside, the king actively seeks the safer corner of the board, preparing to support the pawn advance and potentially engage in the endgame. The move 52, f6 aims to solidify the king's position and prevent white's pawns from advancing further, particularly the h-pawn, by creating a defensive structure, but it also weakens the e6 square and the king's diagonal. This move activates the rook on the b-file, aiming to contest or control this open file and potentially pressure black's isolated pawn on b4. The king's move to c7 centralizes the monarch and prepares to potentially support the b-pawn or defend against white's advancing h-pawn. This check forces black's king to move again, allowing white to reposition their rook to the second rank and target black's vulnerable pawn structure. The king retreats to the safety of the queenside, eyeing the potential of the b-file and preparing to defend the weakened pawns. This pawn thrust creates a passed pawn on d6, which now demands immediate attention from black and poses a serious long-term threat to the black king's defenses. The move advances the pawn to create a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's rook or king. This pawn push is crucial for establishing a strong passed pawn on d7, which will force black to commit their pieces to its defense and potentially create tactical opportunities for white.